Price, who represents the 4th Congressional District here in North Carolina in the United States House of Representatives. He's originally from the small town of Irwin in East Tennessee, but then came to North Carolina where he studied at Mars Hills College. That'd be a good pop quiz. I wonder how many know where Mars Hill is. You do. That's up by Asheville, North Carolina. But then he moved from Mars Hill and came to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was a Morehead Scholar. He then went on to earn both a Bachelor of Divinity degree and a PhD in political science at Yale. Congressman Price was a professor here at Duke, teaching from 1973 until 1986 when he was elected to Congress for the first time. He taught again from 1995 to 1997, at which time after that he was reelected again and has served the state of North Carolina in the House ever since then. When he was teaching, he taught courses in both political science and public policy and has authored 4 books on Congress and the American political system. Congressman Price currently serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is chair of the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee. He's also a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Interior and Environment and on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. I had the pleasure of being on a program on interrogation last fall, as a matter of fact, over in Chapel Hill. And some of you may know that he has a bill that he has authored, a very comprehensive bill that deals with interrogation and detention and prosecution of terrorists, and I believe that bill is currently in 3 different committees in the House: Judiciary, Armed Services, and Intelligence. This whole question of national security, intelligence gathering, interrogation, detention, prosecution of terrorists, I know is a subject that Congressman Price has been very heavily involved in and is vitally interested in. And we are delighted, sir, to have you as our luncheon speaker today, and we very much look forward to your comments. Congressman Price.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. I was just looking at this program, what has been and what is yet to come, and it certainly is a rich menu and a very useful set of discussions at this point in time. So I'm happy to be part of this. We'll hang around as long as I can to get the benefit of some of the other discussions, but I'm very happy to be able to come in and talk about some rather broad gauge matters having to do with the approach that we take in our country to diplomacy and defense and foreign policy, and what I see going on with the new administration, and admittedly some of the things that I hope will go on. We'll also bring in some of our experiences on the Homeland Security front through our subcommittee. I'm happy to have with me today a couple of key staff members. Paul Cox is here somewhere. Paul is our in-house Homeland Security guy, replacing Derek Newby, who some of you worked with for quite some time. Paul is the person who handles this from my personal office. And then Tommy Ross is with me. He's legislative director of our overall operation, but has staffed foreign policy, defense issues for some time now. And also staffs from the personal office, my other chairmanship, which is the House Democracy Assistance Commission, a body that some of you are aware has been, you might say, reinstituted, picking up on the model of the old Frost Commission in the early 90s, where Congress worked in a very intimate way, member to member, staff to staff, with the emerging parliaments of Eastern and Central Europe. That effort was allowed to lapse. We've now revived it with some Eastern European focus still in places like Macedonia, Georgia, Ukraine, but also in places like Kenya and Indonesia, Mongolia, countries that are demonstrating an interest and a capacity in developing the parliamentary side of their democracy in a way that we can latch onto and be helpful with. So we've got 12 partner countries around the world, and it's been a very rewarding endeavor. Tommy is due a lot of credit for staffing that from our office's side. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss the new administration's recalibration of our foreign policy. Scott Silliman has done a great job in organizing this conference and many before this one, and being a facilitator of discussion among all kinds of people nationally about critical policy issues. Certainly, he's assembled an outstanding group of speakers and panelists for these couple of days. Glad to see so many Duke friends here and others who I've worked with over the years. What I've been asked to do is to deliver a set of remarks giving a broad overview of the opportunities and challenges that accompany the U.S. national security strategy at the outset of the Obama administration, and to attempt to tie together some of the themes that you're examining in panels throughout this conference. You will readily recognize that this is a very tall order. So I'll do my best to take a stab at it. Be happy to engage in discussion for whatever time we have after that. Just consider, though, for a moment the breadth of the challenges that the Obama administration now faces across the globe. The United States is currently engaged in two wars that, for much different reasons, very different reasons, are both immensely complicated and do not track with the great preponderance of our nation's warfighting experience. Winding down the first of these wars and recalibrating the second are both high-stakes, high-rank, high-risk ventures in which the administration is now, of course, engaged. Meanwhile, Pakistan, a nation of extreme strategic concern because of its relevance to terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and Central Asian security, is by all accounts on the verge of collapse. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which many believe to be the key driver of instability throughout the entire Middle East, has seemingly reached a low point. The United States remains locked in high-stakes confrontations with two aspiring nuclear powers, Iran and North Korea. There's genocide in Darfur, disintegration in Zimbabwe, tyranny in Burma, and relationships with Russia, China, Venezuela, Syria, and with international organizations like the United Nations are in dire need of wholesale redefinition. If that weren't enough, it took the Obama administration only 79 days to experience, when a U.S. Navy captain was captured by Somali pirates, what every president ultimately learns: that the most difficult moments in our national security come not in facing challenges we fear the most or that we most anticipate, but in confronting the challenges we never expected. So the litany of challenges is long, but the Obama administration faces easily the greatest window of opportunity, I believe, as well. A window of opportunity for U.S. leadership on the world stage, one of the greatest opportunities since the community of nations united behind us following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The reception that the President and the First Lady received at every stop during their European tour last week amply demonstrates how Obama's election has immediately and fundamentally altered the world's perception of the United States and its expectations regarding American leadership. Now, that's not to say the world is putty in our hands. President Obama will not simply be able to snap his fingers for our allies to line up behind us, and there was plenty of evidence of that too last week. We saw during the trip. We're not on the same page with many of the European countries on counter-cyclical measures related to the financial crisis. We still have work to do to convince our NATO allies to increase their engagement in Afghanistan, and so forth. But there's no doubt that once again the United States is at the center of the world stage, and once again all eyes are looking across the Atlantic for strategic direction. So I believe President Obama will have unprecedented opportunities to lead, and to lead on issues that matter: mitigating global climate change, preventing financial collapse, seeking peace in Iran, Israel, and elsewhere, and ridding the world of nuclear weapons. A campaign Obama somewhat surprisingly launched during his first European visit to widespread acclaim. So these are issues that matter immensely to citizens across the world. They're issues that require a substantial and sustained global cooperation, and they require significant resources. There's no question that the Obama administration recognizes these needs as opportunities and is eager to reclaim America's global leadership mantle. At the same time, there are important opportunities to redefine our national security agenda here at home. Here, the administration has already signaled its intentions to undertake radical revisions in a few key areas: defense budgeting, interrogation and detention policies, and immigration. Now, it's hard to make defense budgeting, much less acquisition reform, into the stuff of engaging headlines. But Secretary Gates' efforts to reform the government, the procurement of products and services in the Department of Defense, is going to have far-reaching implications for our national security, from the types of weapons we use to the ways we oversee private security contractors in the field. Likewise, Secretary Gates has indicated his budget proposals under the administration will give the Department of Defense a much-needed makeover. If Gates has his way, the DoD will no longer pour billions into underperforming, over-budget weapons systems better suited for the Cold War than for the new security environment. It'll no longer outsource thousands of jobs to contractors instead of developing in-house capacity and expertise. And it will redefine the relationship between the different types of power in our national security toolbox, more effectively balancing military might with smart diplomacy and targeted development and economic power. The administration's also undertaken an extensive rewriting of our policies on interrogation and detention policy. It has outlawed torture. It's announced the closure of Guantanamo Bay. It's taken measures to reduce reliance on contractors for sensitive activities like interrogation. And I believe even further changes are on the way. Much of this, of course, the details of this, the detailed implementation of this is currently under intensive review. Now, I've worked, as Scott says, I've worked extensively on this issue, and have come to believe that changes in these areas of interrogation practices, detention practices, changes are absolutely critical to our national security policy. They're not only crucial to restoring our moral leadership in the eyes of the world, they're also necessary to ensure success in our fight against terrorism. I think the particular insanity of the policies that the Obama administration inherited was not that they challenged the credibility of our democracy or alienated our allies. They certainly did that. But the particular craziness is that they were adhered to in the face of these costs, despite the fact they didn't work. In fact, they were in so many instances counterproductive. Another key area of reform in which I've been involved is the security of U.S. borders. The illicit movement of product and people across our borders must be effectively addressed by our government. And as chairman of the House subcommittee that funds the Homeland Security Department, funds our border protection and immigration enforcement agencies, I have worked toward that end and of course will continue to do so. Through increased congressional appropriations over the past 2 years, we will have increased the number of Border Patrol agents by more than a third by the end of this year. In addition, through mandates and funding decisions, we have sought to steer the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the ICE agency, to focus its enforcement efforts on illegal aliens who have committed serious crimes. We've seen some initial movement in this direction, and we have charted it very carefully. And we've been reassured by Secretary Napolitano's stated commitment that she shares that priority. Nevertheless, a sustained effort in this area is both necessary and prudent, given the limited resources of the department and given the amply demonstrated possibilities for policy in this area getting diverted. Meanwhile, we've invested significant resources in border infrastructure and technology, President Obama and Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano have signaled their intent to continue pursuing a strong border strategy, which will be enhanced by the administration's new emphasis on policing traffic in the other direction, on pursuing the outbound smugglers of weapons and cash that are fueling the Mexican drug wars. No border strategy, however, can succeed in isolation, nor is it a substitute for comprehensive immigration reform. Ultimately, we must bring our official immigration policies into congruence with the demands of our labor market. Until we do that, the never-ending pursuit of individuals crossing our borders to seek work will continue to divert our Border Patrol and our immigration enforcement agents from dealing with the greatest threats that our homeland faces. Indications are that President Obama plans to pursue immigration reform in the near future. On such a controversial hot-button issue, the president's bound to encounter heavy resistance. In fact, we're detecting a kind of unwelcome adversarial atmosphere on even a usually bipartisan committee like ours in these early weeks of hearings. There's going to be some resistance. There's going to be some political gamesmanship. But the Obama administration has a tremendous opportunity to forge a bipartisan consensus reform over the next couple of years, an opportunity and a challenge. And this is an area of federal policy that demands the kind of leadership only that a determined president can provide. So that's a very brief overview of the landscape of U.S. national security policy at the outset of the Obama administration. The challenges and opportunities confronting the administration are stunning in their scope and complexity. While each item on the agenda will require a particular solution, Obama's greatest challenge particularly will be to develop a unified and integrated strategic approach through which he can take these and other items on in a coherent fashion. What stands out as the critical imperative at this moment is the need to re-imbue U.S. security policy with two essential characteristics, and I'll conclude by elaborating these in a bit more detail. Morality and coherence. Now, much has been made of the Bush administration's departure from traditional American moral norms in formulating its national security strategy. The most oft-cited examples were its discarding of individual protections and judicial rights for detainees. But the uncoupling of national security strategy from its roots in traditional moral theory was far more complete. For example, every previous administration during my political lifetime has clearly spelled out a moral framework for the entry into and conduct of military conflict. In a 1984 speech, President Reagan's Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, famously announced 6 criteria for entering into war. A conflict must be vital to our national security interests. We must have clearly defined objectives. We must commit ourselves wholeheartedly to victory. We must constantly reassess our strategy and objectives. We must have the support of the American people. And 6th, this is a principle that has grounded American national security policy for decades. We must enter into a conflict only as a last resort. Subsequent leaders have revisited Weinberger's 6 principles and have announced their own frameworks. There have been some variations, but rarely any major departures. Throughout the post-Vietnam era, American leaders, both Republican and Democratic, have largely agreed on the moral terms of entering war, terms rooted to a considerable extent in the tradition of just war theory. They've also respected the reciprocity required by America's key alliances, and with some variations, they've understood the advantages of contributing to and working through multilateral institutions. President George W. Bush's administration was the first presidency that did not lay out a framework for making decisions about war, the first since the Weinberger 1984 speech. I think that lack of a clear framework, including a moral framework, was reflected throughout the administration. As we rushed into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the administration never comfortably determined a policy for addressing Darfur. Its discomfort with decisions on sending troops to Liberia and Haiti was manifest, and so on. And beyond indecision, the administration put forth doctrine that began to cut the American ship of state's moorings to just war theory. Its doctrine of preemptive war placed it far outside the moral boundaries of the last several administrations and introduced significant confusion into efforts to navigate and to debate use of force decisions. It may seem odd to say this about perhaps the most openly ideological administration in modern history, but its approach to use of force decisions was hardly the only spot in which the Bush administration broke the link between U.S. national security strategy and its traditional moral underpinnings. Now, the Millennium Challenge Initiative, that was linking up in a tighter way. The connection between foreign assistance and democracy promotion. But in other instances, geopolitical calculations overrode all else in determining levels of aid and support. The administration denied the relevance of internationally recognized human rights and humanitarian principles to security-sensitive U.S. operations. And the administration's rejection of the longstanding U.S. commitment to collective security and shared global obligations in favor of unilateralism represented a fundamental moral and strategic shift. These departures from America's post-World War II bipartisan foreign policy consensus came to define the Bush administration and to ordain the successes and failures of its national security policies. So the first challenge of the Obama administration will be to situate U.S. national security policy on clear and firm moral grounds. In the post-9/11 era, simply returning to the pre-Bush moral consensus, however, may not be necessary or certainly not easy. The world has changed. On the one hand, the administration must reaffirm the tradition of just war theory, human rights, and collective security. These traditions are fundamental to the American experience. They form the basis of a developing international consensus. On the other hand, the new administration's national security strategy must wrestle with questions unique to our current context. It must obviously wrestle with the morality of use of force decisions in relation to non-state actors. Israel's war with Hezbollah in 2006 has become the subject of intense debate in the halls of the Pentagon precisely for this reason. How will the U.S. respond to an attack from a non-state actor? How can the military clearly define objectives when neither peace treaty nor surrender is a likely outcome? Should non-state combatants be treated as soldiers or as criminals? And of course, recent events in Somalia pose these questions even more starkly. The new administration must address the long-lingering moral question of how we confront genocide, along with similar questions relating to interventions in failed states, brutal tyrannies, and humanitarian catastrophes. And it must determine moral responsibility in questions that know no international boundaries, such as climate change and avian flu. Restoring morality to our national security policy, I hasten to add, is not a matter of simply deducing our obligations from the UN Declaration of Human Rights or any similar list of principles. It does not require that we ignore our nation's self-interest, on the contrary, or strategic alliances as we develop our global security posture. We're not talking about an exact analog here of personal morality. We're talking about statesmanship and the way statesmanship incorporates moral obligation and moral perspectives. In fact, a conscientious approach to national security requires that we acknowledge the complexity of our competing moral and strategic demands. It also requires the kind of sensibility that President Obama recently displayed in Europe, a humility that acknowledges the biases of our own viewpoint and the flaws of our past. Seems to me, looking at those speeches, that President Obama has learned something from Reinhold Niebuhr, maybe even from Abraham Lincoln. As far as I'm concerned, that's a very auspicious sign. We've seen some uncomprehending accounts, by the way, of what President Obama was doing with those speeches in Europe. One of the most uncomprehending was reproduced in our local paper this weekend by Charles Krauthammer. Krauthammer wrote, "It's passing strange for a world leader to celebrate his own country's decline." What a strange interpretation. What an uncomprehending description that is of what the president was up to. I would say probably willfully uncomprehending. The kinds of things Obama was saying, that kind of appropriate expression of humility, it's not a sign of weakness, nor is it a sign of weakness to acknowledge past mistakes. That's not a sign of decline. In fact, what is the ability and the confidence to identify and acknowledge and correct past errors if it's not a strength? Such an approach can only strengthen our policy and our strategy judgments, and it can only strengthen our respect in the eyes of the world. So restoring morality to national security requires that we develop our strategy and policies with a clear rooting in the ethical values and traditions that have defined our country for the last 225 years. Further, it requires that we filter our own self-interests, our international commitments and alliances, and our capabilities and limitations through this moral lens. And it requires that we undertake the entire enterprise with self-awareness and a circumspection that allows us to identify and correct and move beyond the errors of the past. The second great challenge for the Obama administration will be restoring coherence to our national security policy. Earlier, I offered a brief survey of the tremendous array of high-level, high-risk challenges that face the United States around the globe. It's tempting to say that the scope of these challenges is unprecedented. At the very least, one might think back to the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, who inherited a war in Korea, an unstable and conflict-prone Middle East, an ascendant Soviet Union, the prospect of mutually assured destruction, and a rapidly escalating U.S.-Soviet competition for supremacy across the globe, from Congo to Guatemala. Coherence, however, was relatively easy for Eisenhower, and for every president through Reagan who followed. Our national security strategy was formed in the context of the Cold War, and we turned every tool within our national security toolbox toward victory in this existential contest. We formed alliances and measured trade against the backdrop of our competition with the Soviet Union. Our military intervention policy was aimed at stopping Soviet advances, most famously as articulated in the so-called domino theory. Our nuclear policy was designed to simultaneously deter Soviet aggression and reduce the Soviet arsenal. The end of the Cold War obviously left the United States in something of a strategic vacuum. The story of the last 2 decades has been, at least in part, a story of our efforts to regain strategic coherence in this vacuum. President Bush sought to fill the vacuum by organizing U.S. national security strategy post 9/11 around the so-called global war on terror. Once again, alliances were formed and trade was directed against the backdrop of our effort to root out terrorism. Our military intervention policy sought to take the fight to the terrorists to destroy terrorist havens. Our nuclear policy underwent a significant revision with new initiatives designed to develop nuclear weapons that would destroy underground targets. Even our programs and agencies dealing with natural disasters were subordinated to anticipating terrorist threats with disastrous consequences in the Gulf Coast and elsewhere. But the past 8 years have proven terrorism to be an insufficient concept for organizing our national security strategy. That's not to say the U.S., of course, not to say the U.S. shouldn't be concerned about terrorism. However, terrorism should only be viewed as one of the threats, not the only threat against which the U.S. must be defended. Thus, after 7 years of the global war on terror, the United States once again faces a strategic vacuum. Putting aside American propensities over the last 60 years, there's no need to define our national security necessarily vis-a-vis a singular threat. In fact, not just the last 7 years, but much of our Cold War experience points up the perils of doing that. But strategic coherence, I believe, is still imperative. I think we've got to seek this coherence on several levels. First, there must be a coherence among U.S. policies around the globe. A good example can be found in the Middle East. The administration can't afford to take on key challenges in the region, the war in Iraq, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, as if they were independent of each other. Must recognize the deep linkages between each situation and form a coherent approach to addressing all of them. Moreover, that approach must be integrated with related policies, such as is reflected, I think, in the way the Obama administration has approached Afghanistan and Pakistan. It should be integrated with our democracy promotion efforts. Secondly, there must be coherence between the efforts of the U.S. and the efforts of the rest of the world. The current financial crisis is an important example of this necessity, as the Obama administration is quickly learning. U.S. leadership with regard to the global financial crisis will not amount to much if it's working against the efforts of European or Asian leaders. Likewise, we must synchronize our efforts to address issues like climate change and HIV/AIDS and international terrorism. And finally, there must be coherence between our strategy and the resources we devote to its implementation. This may be the biggest challenge of all. The Obama administration will need to rebalance the allocation of resources among diplomacy and development and defense and homeland security, ensuring that none of these key elements is shortchanged. And it must do so at a time when the federal budget is under enormous historic pressure. Moreover, the administration must make decisions about the size and organization and deployment of our military forces, law enforcement, and border patrol that will have profound effects on our national security. Without coherence among these decisions and between these areas and our broader national security strategy, the Obama administration will be at best effective, at worst disastrous. So, moral undergirding and strategic coherence go hand in hand. The moral traditions that have guided U.S. policy over the past 225 years point our national security strategy toward common and sustained objectives: justice, peace, democracy, liberty, basic human rights. Such traditions offer a guiding purpose, constantly pulling U.S. national security strategy away from self-interest too narrowly conceived, and refocusing us toward collective security, coexistence, and shared prosperity. At the same time, coherent security strategy, clearly articulated, helps marshal the talents and resources of the American public, uniting us in pursuit of common goals. This coherence fosters public service, motivating America's most promising individuals to take part in the collective formation and implementation of security policies, and it facilitates effective American leadership in the world. Unfortunately, the collapse of one has meant the collapse of both in the last few years. This breakdown, more than any single individual policy misstep, will be more important for the Obama administration, most important for the Obama administration to overcome. Restoring morality, restoring coherence to American national security policy will be the Obama administration's greatest legacy or its greatest failure. With that, let me again thank Scott and all of you for welcoming me here today. I'm grateful for the opportunity and be happy to respond to questions for whatever time we have.
Thank you, Congressman. We do not have the microphones here, so if in fact you have a question or a comment, Price, could you please stand and speak as loudly as you can? Robbie.
Congressman Price, I agree with you concerning the morality of restoring morality to our practice of foreign policy, particularly when we go to the use of force. noticed you didn't mention once, I was listening, the UN Charter, which in Article 2.4 prohibits the use of force or the threat of force except under two circumstances, self-defense or under Security Council authority. How does that fit in?
I really didn't mention any particular laws or documents, national or international. I was kind of distilling from numerous sources my sense of what the guiding principles should be. I, of course, take those principles very seriously. I also understand that as a realistic matter, there are instances where, because of the way the UN is structured, the way the Security Council works, those do not afford clear and consistent guidance in each and every international situation. In other words, it's determining how we proceed and the kind of process we follow is not as simple a matter as of just reading the charter, because the extent to which we can act on our perceptions of our self-interest and also of our obligations in the world is going to depend on other things than just the dictates of that document. But it's a foundational document. It's one that I think is not only consistent with, but supportive of the values I've articulated, and I want to see our country take it very seriously.
Thank you, Congressman.
You're speaking about morality and coherence, and I am very curious to find out how the terrorist term cannot be used with the terrorist. It's part of the policy. However, this week, the Department of Homeland Security identified our military personnel as capable of terrorist attacks and singling out our veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan as possible terrorists. I don't understand what would be the coherence in the change in the new administration in that aspect.
You're talking about the news reports of reports having to do with, I think, mental health and the conditions under which our veterans were returning from, or our military people were returning from overseas engagement?
No, sir. I'm speaking about a report news that identified the veterans coming from Afghanistan and Iraq as possibly extreme right
We're talking.
individuals.
They're all right. Yes. We are talking about the same thing. I just didn't articulate it very clearly. The report does incorporate some information about the emotional health of returning troops and some of the problems that we've seen. But the larger context, you're right, is about the emerging right-wing threats that our security agencies have perceived with the advent of President Obama and other changes in the national scene. With due respect, I do not think your rendering of this does justice to the spirit of that report, and I haven't seen the full text of it. I've seen the news reports, but I'd be very, very surprised if upon actually reading that report, you would give it that characterization. I think we're talking here about the kinds of things security agencies do all the time, about looking at the sources of extremism in our country and the possible sources of extreme threatening behavior and where that might emanate from. And as I recall, the characterization I saw of the report said that since the Oklahoma City bombings, there has been a reduction in the perceived threats from some of these extreme groups, but that there's vibrations being picked up now that these organization efforts and these threats are are somewhat resurging. I want to know about that. I think we all should want to know about it. But I really don't believe that the characterization of who might be vulnerable, who might be caught up in these movements, I think that's a fairly jaundiced reading, if I may say so, about the way our veterans are treated in that context.
A question over here.
Congressman Price Kelly, I'm the State Department representative here at Duke, and I want to thank you for the extra money Congress has given to the State Department this year. I very much appreciated your remarks. Today, President Obama is in Mexico, and I wondered if you could situate Mexico in your framework in terms of national security challenges. You mentioned border security and immigration. Those are two issues we associate with Mexico. It's also our third largest trading partner, probably third largest oil supplier this year. How does Congress look at Mexico in terms of challenges and opportunities?
Well, we focus fairly specifically on the recent developments and on the homeland security aspect of this, because we just had hearings on our committee regarding the drug cartels and the border situation, and that's of course item number one in the president's visit to the president of Mexico. I think the Mexican government has taken commendable steps toward getting a hold of this situation, toward sending troops to the border region, showing every indication that it takes this seriously. They have also been pretty candid with us about ways we can help beyond just fortifying our own border. The flow southward of thousands of weapons every day is appalling. And they're coming from thousands of gun shops and gun shows with just a flow of weapons that's virtually unimpeded. The flow of cash, and of course our insatiable demand for drugs. You know, this is an area where there needs to be a very honest and candid accounting on both sides of the elements of the problem, and a kind of shared responsibility. So it's an alarming situation. I mean, thousands of brutal, savage deaths in Mexico now occurring every year, and too much of this spilling over the border, although not in a wholesale fashion, thankfully, at this point. But it's a situation we need to get a hold of. It is the main bilateral issue at this moment. I'm also certain that President Obama will get a candid, some candid talk about our immigration policies and about the need our country has to get a hold of this broader immigration issue. I've been down on the south. First thing I did, well, I went to New Orleans first thing as subcommittee chairman. But the second thing I did was to take helicopter rides along the southwest border. I've done that twice now, Texas and the Arizona-California border. Very different situations, by the way, in many respects. But I've seen a lot of Border Patrol agents down there, and I've never had one say to me, "This is just about enforcement," because these guys, above all, know that that's not what it's just about. That we got to do a good job with enforcement. We got to do a better job with enforcement. But we will never get a hold of this problem without a comprehensive immigration policy, and that means a policy, basically, as I said, that brings our official policy into line with our labor market needs, and then we will have a much sounder basis on which to crack down and enforce the law. So those are the main items at the moment. But it is at a crisis point with respect to that violence in northern Mexico, and I don't know of any greater homeland security challenge right now, any greater priority than getting that situation not just contained but really under control on the Mexican side.
Congressman, Steve's question and your response, I couldn't ask for a better lead-in into the final panel we're going to have this afternoon, which is the impact of immigration policy on national security. But join me in thanking Congressman
Thank you.
Price for
Thank
being here. Again, we will be reconvening in the auditorium at 2:15, and I will there be turning over the podium to Professor Schanzer. So we'll see you back there at 2:15.